Welcome to the final session of today. Hopefully you've had some awesome sessions already. Today I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about how do we align a multi-tiered system of support with our SST process, and where does special education kind of fit into the world of a multi-tiered system of support. My name is Dr. Rebecca Harrison. I'm the coordinator of academic interventions at Orange County Department of Education. But first and foremost, I was a classroom teacher for about 15 years. I taught kindergarten and fifth grade. I'm also the mother. I pulled up their picture because I want to show you. These two are my inspiration. They're actually the reason I left the classroom. My daughter on the left, her name is Natalie. She's 14 and now a senior in high school. My daughter on the right, Olivia, she's 10 and in the fifth grade. And Natalie has a primary diagnosis of cerebral palsy. She uses a wheelchair for mobility. She was totally blind until she's 4. Now she's just mostly blind. She did not speak until she was 6, and it's because of a teacher that she started speaking, a teacher that held very high expectations for her, and I was gonna say made her communicate, which is true, but really encouraged her to communicate. My other daughter was in inclusive preschools all from the time she was 14 months old until she entered the public education system. And once she entered public education, those two will never go to school together again, which is heartbreaking as both a mother and an educator to know that my two daughters who started out their educational careers in the same school, having their needs met by the same teachers, were then forced to separate because our systems just aren't set up for our kids to be in school together. So I left the classroom to start coaching teachers about inclusive practices and equity. And now I work at the county office helping people put systems in place to make these things possible so that future siblings, my hope is that future siblings will have some experiences where they get to see one another at school. This agenda that I've shared with you is merely a suggestion for myself to kind of try to keep me on topic and to be able to point you in the direction of the resources that I've shared with you. The main resource is this one here, which is a digital notebook that I've created. I present this from the county office quite a bit throughout the year as teams implementing MTSS are asking me questions. Where does SPED fit in with multi-tiered system of support? How does our SST change because of this? And this is normally a 4-hour session. So I shared the entire notebook with you, which is way more information than I will ever be able to present to you in 1 hour. So my hope is just to begin to get your wheels thinking about the relationship between MTSS, special education, and how the SST process can actually disrupt the inequities that we've seen over time instead of being used as an avenue to create those inequitable systems. So I'll start off with a story. This is a true story. When I was a fifth grade teacher, we started off the school year and our task was to get to know our students for the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of school. And then at the end of that period of time, we were asked by our principals to meet in his office as a grade level team with a list of students that we were concerned about. And this was the start of our meetings to meet the needs of our students. So I would show up with my list. Here's my list of students that are struggling in math, and here's my list of students that are struggling in ELA. And the conversation went very similar to this. Okay, yes, I can see that is a list of students who are struggling in math, and that is a list of students who are struggling in ELA. Now you're going to go back to your classroom and you're going to do 6 weeks of intervention with those students. And then we're going to meet again in 6 weeks and we're going to talk about what happened. How did they respond? Who's still struggling? Who's not? So on and so forth. So 6 weeks later, we come back to his office as a grade level. And I'm like, this is my list of students who are struggling in math. And these are my list of students who are struggling in ELA. And he would say like, yeah, I can see, like that is a list of students who are struggling in math. And yep, that's a list of students who are struggling in ELA. Why don't you go back to your classroom and do another 6-week cycle of intervention, and we'll meet back here again in 6 weeks and we'll talk about what changed. So I'd go back to my classroom, do a little something, who knows what it was, and then come back in 6 weeks, and guess what we talked about? A list of students who were still struggling in math and a list of students who were still struggling in ELA. And this went on for multiple cycles until finally in February, now we had 3 cycles of intervention, data to prove that these students were not making progress. And that's when we began the SST process. So we would initiate that SST process where we would come together, meet with the specialists, the parents, and try to figure out what do we need to do to meet the needs of these students. Often by the time that happened, it was almost the end of the school year, and then the whole thing started over again the next year. Does this story sound familiar to any of you, or was I the only one who lived through that? I'm seeing some yeses, like I kind of feel like maybe some of you have been there. I'm hoping some of the no's are like, that is the craziest story I've ever heard of. So hopefully, I think some of you are with me and some of you are like, what in the world? Can anybody tell me why that doesn't work? Why didn't we see changes in what our students were doing? Yes?
Did you know what interventions to implement? Did you know what you were supposed to do to help these kids?
No, I didn't. Thank you for recognizing that. So one, students who are struggling in math is a lot, right? Math is a set of skills that students acquire both developmentally and as they progress along the continuum of mathematical concepts and mathematical knowledge. So one, I didn't even know what they were struggling in. All I know is that when I taught, they didn't get it. And when I gave a test, they didn't pass it. That was all I knew. Same thing with ELA. Reading is also a lot. It's also a set of developmental skills that students then apply to a text that oftentimes they need to be somewhat interested in order to engage in applying those skills to that text. I had no idea what the actual gaps in student learning were. Nor did I know what to do about it. So one thing I wish that principal had asked me is, what will you do when you go back to your classroom for that 6-week cycle of intervention? What else is wrong with that story? What data was I even looking at, right? I was like, they look like deer in the headlights. Yep, that kid, he seems like a deer in the headlights. I gave them this math test, they didn't pass it. So I had my anecdotal data, the things that I was told to keep track of, like this kid's lost, right? I had my stack of math tests, here's the math test, and the principal was like, that's some data, that's a list, those are kids that are struggling. The other thing that happened was nobody came by to see what I was actually teaching in the first place, or if I was actually doing said intervention in the classroom. Now, I'm not saying I went back to my classroom and did nothing. I taught the best I could. I pulled a small group. I taught it louder. I taught it slower. I taught it for longer periods of time, and we loved it. Because if we're already struggling during our 60-minute math block, Pulling them for 30 more minutes was torture. So every time there was a fire drill, every time my PE minutes were behind, every time there was an art master's assembly, every time there was, you name it, guess what got cut off of our schedule? Intervention. Because it was torture for all of us. I felt like a failure over and over and over again, and so did my students. And the only thing I knew was that if we did this multiple times, eventually I would have a meeting with the specialists on campus who would give me additional strategies. But I had to go through this song and dance for 3 6-week cycles in order to have that meeting. Exactly. Because those resources, those experts on campus were so few and far between. Oftentimes they were shared across campuses. Oftentimes other teachers were doing the same song and dance I was so that they could meet the needs of their students. And so we had SST meetings all over the place. People are trying to document it. You know, there's all this paperwork that went involved. So my argument today is going to be, how can we build a better system so that teachers and students get what they need at the first indication of struggle? And what data are we going to look at to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing? So hang with me. In this notebook, we're going to be looking at several things. Not my kids. We already looked at them. We're going to be looking at the California MTSS framework and the continuum of support. We'll talk a little bit about some of those universal supports in UDL, designated and integrated ELD, culturally and linguistically relevant teaching. Most importantly, we're going to be talking about the data that drives that system. And I know it sounds boring, but I'm going to try to make data exciting for you because I love it. Then we'll talk about how do you then structure all of that into what we call the tiered intervention matrix. And then you'll have the opportunity to reflect what in your system might be the missing piece, we'll call it. Is it teams? Is it coaching? Is it resources? Is it your schedule? Is it your practices? So we'll kind of work through all of that at a fairly rapid pace. So first we're going to go into the notebook here on slide 5. This is the California MTSS framework. How many of you are familiar with the California MTSS framework? Awesome. So in addition to being the coordinator of academic interventions, I'm also a California MTSS implementation coach for the state. So I work with schools and districts across the state implementing their multi-tiered system of support, which includes the whole child domain, which is inclusive academic, behavior, social, emotional, and mental health instruction, helping schools organize their administrative leadership teams on campus to be able to create those sustainable systems on their school site. How do we create those integrated supports so that students don't need those labels or don't need those extensive processes to access additional services and supports that already exist on the campus? How are we engaging the family and the community into that conversation so that we know the way we do business at school is the way the families and communities want us to do business at school? And then finally, how are we building those inclusive policy structures in practice? That's a lot of words. All it means is how do we know that the district is creating pathways to success for the schools through their policy practices, and not creating barriers for schools to be able to do what they need for the betterment of their students, and not creating barriers with their policies. So that's the fastest overview of the California MTSS framework I've ever done. If you want to know more, you can click here. It'll take you into that really in-depth overview of the framework, which I'm not going to do right now. What I want to get to is this continuum of support. So remember that whole child domain that was inclusive academic, behavior, social, emotional, mental health? The continuum of support defines what do we have in place for all students in all of those areas. Typically, we think of mental health supports as a tier 3 support. We wait until students have major mental health issues before we connect them with a mental health resource. But what the California MTSS framework tries to do is help us define what are we doing for all students in all of those areas in the form of universal support. So everybody gets academic instruction, everybody gets behavior supports, everybody gets social emotional learning, and everybody gets mental health supports. What are we then doing for some students who need a little bit more in one or more of those areas? And what do we have for a few students who need quite a bit more in one or more of those areas? So the way this relates to my story is that I was teaching all of my students according to our curriculum and according to the best practices that I had learned. But what I began to identify is that some of my students weren't being successful, and I needed to provide them with something extra. I just didn't know what that was or what it looked like. And then there was probably even a few students who needed a lot extra. But again, I didn't know what that was or what it looked like. And so this whole thing is driven by data-based decision making, which again, I thought I was doing. I had my data, right? There was some deers in the headlights, there was a stack of math tests. But that's not the data that we're talking about. We'll dive deep specifically into what those data pieces should be in just a moment, but we can't decide who needs what unless we know what we're looking at and why. The other thing is MTSS, the first iteration included percentages here. It was like 80% of your students will be successful in tier 1, and 15% of your students might need tier 2, and maybe 5% of your students might need tier 3. Personally, I like the percentages because it was kind of a way to frame my thinking. If 80% of my students are not successful the first time I teach it, guess what? That's a mirror back onto me. Because statistically, first best instruction should meet the needs of 80% of your students. So that's first cracker out of the box. The principal could have been like, well, this seems like a lot of kids. How many kids do you have in your class? Because this is like 10. And I only had 30, so that's not 80%, right? That could have been the principal's opportunity right out the gate to address what I needed as a teacher to be a better teacher for my students in the first place. 15% of our students might need a little bit more, and people used to think that then that 5%, that intensive intervention, was special education. It's not. So I'll answer the question right now, where does special education fit into a multi-tiered system of support? It's both within and outside of MTSS. So we heard this morning that students with special needs, first and foremost, are general education students, which means they have a right to access everything that we provide to everybody else on a universal, a supplemental, and an intensified level. Their IEP defines what they get in addition to all of that, or what modifications to this they're entitled to. So that's why I say special education is both within and outside of a multi-tiered system of support. Kids get it all. The IEP defines what else they get. It's not the third tier service, which is how this was used in the past, and oftentimes that's how we saw an over-identification of students into special education because of teachers like me. I gave them a little bit of extra, they didn't get it. The next step then is to begin to identify them for special education. So let me go back to my suggested talking points here. So universal design for learning, there's slides in here about that will take you on a deep dive into UDL, but that's a whole nother conference actually, not just a whole nother session. But universal design for learning means that we find out where students are on that continuum of learning, and we meet them there, and we push them forward. It also means that we give them choice in how they move forward, and we also give them choice in how they demonstrate to us what they know and are able to do. So it's giving them multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. More on that in the notebook. The California ELA-ELD framework also says that designated and integrated ELD is a universal support. It's students' right as second language learners or multilingual learners to access their English language development as part of universal support. Oftentimes in the past, we saw that as an intervention. Here's why that's problematic. Because interventions are designed in short cycles. So if students didn't make enough progress in that language intervention, then it was amped up to intensified intervention, and then we started identifying second language learners for special education because their language acquisition wasn't meeting the design of intervention. That's why language development is part of universal supports. If you don't believe me, you can read chapter 9 of the California ELA-ELD framework, my favorite chapter. It's on access and equity, and it says that exact thing. Designated integrated ELD is not an intervention. Also, undergirding all of this, all levels of student support, universal, supplemental, and intensified, is culturally and linguistically relevant teaching. We have to honor the lived experiences, the identities, and the funds of knowledge that our students are bringing to school so that we can meet them where they're at and help them move to develop their most authentic, their most genius, and their most valued self. Not the version, the green dot, right, that we think they should be. Okay, those are my other tiny soapboxes. I'm gonna take a sip of water. I get excited. Now data, the other exciting thing. This one I am gonna go to page 17 of the notebook, and we'll talk about how my principal and I could have done better. Did I say 17? I meant 16. Whoops. Okay, so when we talk about data-based decision-making, we are not talking about deer in the headlights, stack of math tests. What we are talking about is a formula for success. So oftentimes, what we're trying to impact are what the National Implementation Research Network calls socially significant outcomes. We're trying to change the outcome. Oftentimes, this is in the form of student outcome data, right? We want to see evidence that our students are learning or that our students are advancing in academics, behavior, social, emotional, mental health. But when we only look at that data, what ends up happening is we try all this stuff, and when we don't see changes in that student data, who do we blame? The student. We say, well, all these adults did all these things, and nothing happened to the students, so there must be something wrong with them. We need to send them somewhere else so that they can be fixed. But just like in my story, we were looking at student outcome data. We were looking, I mean, obviously the look in their eyes is not actual data, but the math test could be considered actual data, right? So we could be looking at that student outcome data and making inferences about that student's ability from just student outcome data. But what NERN, my favorite acronym, it's so fun to say, NERN. What NERN suggests is that we need to be looking at 3 other pieces of data, and those are the blue ones. The first one are those effective innovations. Those are my instructional practices. Have those been vetted? Have those been verified? Have those been adopted, or did I buy them on TPT, or am I just making it up as I go along? Yes, snaps for TPT. It's cute, but it's not an effective innovation. It hasn't been proven by research to produce the outcomes that we're looking for. So we'll be making sure that we're using effective innovations. Then we need to be looking at, were they implemented in the way that they were designed according to research? So question 1, did you actually go do it? Or did you let everything else derail it because it's torture? And if you did go do it, did you do it as often as you were supposed to? Did you do it in the way that it was designed? And did you do it in a way that was intentionally meeting the needs of your students? So we call that implementation data. Was it actually implemented? And then finally, there needs to be enabling context. Did I, as the teacher, have the capacity to go back and teach what was being asked of me in the way that I was being asked to do it? So we call that capacity data. Capacity could be my knowledge and skill about teaching that effective innovation. Capacity could be time and space for me to be able to do that effective implementation. It could also be, do I have the resources necessary to teach that effective innovation? So this means sometimes taking a look at your master schedule. Does the master schedule frequently interrupt valuable instructional minutes? Or can we create a time of the week where assemblies need to happen so that they interrupt instruction as little as possible? Do I have 35 students in my classroom and I'm supposed to pull some students over here to maybe like a group table? Do we have flexible seating? Do we even have space for me to pull this small group? Do we have systems and structures in place for what everybody else is doing while I'm working with these students? So that's capacity. So what NERN is suggesting is that in order to achieve those socially significant outcomes, we also need to be taking a look at our effective innovations. What are we teaching? The implementation of that, how are we doing it? And the capacity. Does the people and the system have the capacity to do what's being asked of them? Once all of those are in place, then we can look at student outcome data. But it's written as a multiplication problem because if any one of those blue pieces is missing, we cannot expect to see socially significant outcomes. So if we're missing effective innovations, if we're not measuring and monitoring the implementation of that, and if we're not measuring and monitoring the capacity of the people and the systems to do it, then it is inappropriate for us to be looking at student outcome data. So that brings me back to student outcome data. To your point, what data were we even looking at? What skills was I even targeting? This is where your comprehensive assessment comes in. How are we screening students for literacy development, numeracy development, behavior, social emotional needs, mental health needs? How are we screening students? A screener just tells you who needs help and who doesn't. That's about as far as I got. A true universal screener will tell you, without intervention, where will these students end up? Once we've screened for who needs help and who doesn't, how are we then diagnosing the specific area that these students need help, whether it's the specific gap in numeracy development, the specific gap in literacy development, the specific skills that the students need in order to be able to access rigorous text, the specific social emotional need of that student, whether it's sense of belonging, sense of self, social awareness, responsible decision making, whatever it is, or mental health. What has that student experienced that is causing them to have mental health struggles? Is it trauma? Is it identity? Is it something happened at home? Did they witness an event? What is it that the student is struggling with? So that we can target that specific thing. We can find the right innovation and match it to that identified need. So we've screened, we've diagnosed, we implement, then we monitor that progress. How is what we're doing working for this student? Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to make adjustments? Did we ask the kid if it's working? Do they like it? Do they want something different? And we monitor that progress until we close those gaps. When we do that, oftentimes we can avoid the SST process altogether, or this becomes the SST process with the understanding that the SST process is not intended to get students identified for special education, that the SST process is truly a student study team, or I've even heard it called a student success team. We're meeting about the student as a team to talk about how we can help the student become successful. Like I said, oftentimes in the past, it was step one on the road to special education. And we have to disrupt that with what we're looking at, how we're looking at, and what our purpose is for coming together as a team. Did I make data exciting? Think about it a little bit different? Okay. So then, how do we put all this together into a meaningful plan, I guess we'll call it, so that everybody in that meeting is on board? So that when I leave that meeting with my principal, it's not just go try something for 6 weeks and then come back and tell us how it went, right? That's not the plan. So what we call the tiered intervention matrix is one plan, and I'll show you what that looks like. The reason I say it's one plan, it's because I like it because it includes all of the things we just talked about in one document. What I don't like about it, do you know how many copies I have of this in my Google Drive? I need to make that not a forced copy. There's like a template view thing I need to do. So what I like about this is that it's a way to structure the conversation in that meeting and capture everything that we just talked about. What I don't like about it is it's very linear. It's like one very long document, and it's also not very teacher friendly, in my opinion. If I was a teacher and I went back to my classroom, I'd be like, what am I supposed to do with this? So I'll show you this, and then I'll show you how my teacher brain thinks about it. And you guys can, obviously, you'll make your own whatever works best for your school. So at the top of the tiered intervention matrix, you're able to sit down and talk about who are we meeting about, who's present, that's where name comes in, school, district, whatever information you want. Are we talking about literacy, math, behavior, SEL, something else? And by the way, you can do this for one student, or if you see a pattern, right? We consistently see second grade students who come in with this particular need. When that happens, we already have a plan for how we're gonna address it. We don't even necessarily need to meet about it. We can just build the teacher's capacity with this thing that we've already created. So this can be on a small scale, large scale. So here's where you're able to describe what universal support looks like. What do all students have access to in this area? So if it's literacy, what does language arts instruction look like in this particular grade level or in this particular area. Same thing for math. If it's SEL, do we have an SEL curriculum? Do we teach SEL every day? Is it embedded into our academics? Same thing with mental health. And then we're able to define when that happens. Is it every day? Is it once a week? Is it 60 minutes? Is it only on Fridays? Whatever that universal support is. Here we're able to define what that screening process is. So how are we determining who needs help and who doesn't, right? That initial question. Do you have a hand up?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify. Are you talking about specific benchmark or standard, or what is the form targeting?
That's a great question. Any of it. So if you have a student who's struggling or a group of students who's struggling in a particular area, this is going to help you drill down to that exact thing. Sometimes it's standards, but particularly in the areas of literacy and numeracy, oftentimes it's skills, which are different. Our standards are based on skill development, but skills themselves are taught in a slightly different way. It could also be behavior needs. It could also be behavior skills. It could be social emotional needs. It could be social emotional skills. So this is where you're able to drill down to what that exactly is. How are we even screening for that? How are we capturing who needs help and who doesn't? Is there a tool for that? Who's doing that? How are they doing that? When are they doing that? Who's looking at that data? And are there particular benchmarks that we're looking for? So obviously, literacy and numeracy have research-based screeners that will give you all of this information. Social emotional learning is working on them. Behavior is also working on them. And here we're able to make if-then statements. So if the student is identified as needing help, then what are we going to do? If the student is identified as needing a lot of help, then what are we going to do? And we're working on putting in here that diagnostic piece. What tool are you going to use to diagnose that specific gap in skills or need? And then here you're able to define that supplemental intervention. So you've screened your kids, you've identified what the need is. How are you going to meet that need? What's the area? Is it a skill? Is it a need? You're able to define that there in the bottom left-hand corner. Who's going to administer that intervention? When is it going to be administered? What are the specific instructional practices that will be used to address that need? And what are some additional options that we might consider? Because you don't want to get into a 6-week cycle of intervention and realize 2 weeks in that it's not working, and either have to stay the course because you got 4 more weeks, or reconvene and put the whole process off. You want to have some additional things there in your back pocket. Here's where you're able to define what might that intensified support look like, right? That little bit even more for a few students. Again, what's the identified area, the skill, the who, the when, the what, and the additional options to consider. How are you going to monitor that progress? How are you going to monitor that it's actually being done? This can be lesson plans, anecdotal records, student work samples, principal walkthroughs, right? Observations. And then how are we going to make sure that the capacity was built appropriately? Yes. They can be. So again, if you're using this for one student, you might have a student that one student who benefits from supplemental support in one or more areas, but also intensified support in one or more areas. So if this were for one student, then yeah, those things would be happening concurrently. But if this is for a group of students and you're looking at, let's say, encoding and decoding multisyllabic words, then students who need a little bit of support in that area are going to get that supplemental intervention, and students who need intensified support in that one area are going to get that intensified intervention. So it might be different students, but it's happening simultaneously, so that those students with the intense needs don't have to wait until the needs are met of the students who have the supplemental needs. They're kind of happening at the same time. Good question. And then here, how are we going to make sure that the capacity has been built? This is where I wish my principal would have asked me, do you know now what is expected of you? Do you as the teacher have any needs to be able to go back and do that? Do you need to work with the coach? Can we provide you with some professional development? Would you like to co-teach this with the coach? Would you like to co-teach a couple of these with the special education teacher? What can we do to build your capacity? Because I don't know about you, but as a brand new baby teacher sitting in the principal's office saying, I don't know how to do what you're asking me to do, I was 9 years on a temporary contract. There was no way I was going to admit in that meeting that I didn't know how to do what the principal was asking me to do, because I was afraid I would lose my job and not get it back at the end of the year. Had the principal known that and created space for it to be okay for me to say that and ask for help, probably would have changed the trajectory for many of the students that we were talking about. But that's a system thing, right? This disrupts that system. So again, it captures everything. It's a great way to structure that conversation. But to me as a teacher, I don't need to know all of that information. So how I like to think about it is a couple of things. So these cycles of intervention. What data are we looking at? Is it a skill or a standard that my student is struggling with? What goals do we have for that standard or that skill? What specifically do each of these students need? Talking about students by name, so that when I go back to my classroom, I'm like, I know what this kid needs, I know what this kid needs, because we just talked about them specifically by name. Bringing students into that fold, having them being a part of that conversation, and setting those SMART goals. Making those plans, going and doing the thing, right? And then after we do the thing, having the opportunity to reflect multiple times. Maybe I've done one intervention, 1 week of intervention, having somebody to talk me through, what did you do? What did you try? How is it going? Are you going to change it? Are your students showing progress? It doesn't have to be an official meeting. And then constantly going back to that data until we see the students move to where we want them to move. And sometimes when you look at that data, you might have multiple cycles happening at once, kind of like our colleague asked here, right? Are they happening simultaneously? And you might have multiple students in multiple groups for multiple reasons, but then it kind of becomes like keeping all the plates in the air. And this is where universal design for learning comes in. So if I'm going to teach one lesson to everybody, I know what you need because I just talked about you in my meeting, and I know you're probably going to need help in this one area, whereas somebody else might need help in another area. So as I'm teaching, I'm keeping all of that in mind. It doesn't necessarily have to be, let me pull you to my small group table, but how can I meet your needs in a way that validates that we're all in different places and we're all trying to get somewhere, and we're all going to get there together, getting the help that we need along the way. And then finally, this one's really good for kind of some of those big heavy hitter areas. So I like to think of this as like a marble run, that's what I call it. You know, the game where you like pour all the marbles in the top and they all go different ways. So one, that universal screener, you're pouring all of your students in there. And they're red, yellow, and green already to represent the preconceived notions that we have about students. And pouring them into that universal screener removes the assumption and the bias that we have and gives us actual data about who might need help and who might not. Just that piece, when I was coaching and we screened our students, the assumption was that our second language learners were going to be the students who needed the most help, and this school had traditionally been focusing so much effort on their second language learners. But when we poured them all into that universal screener, we saw that actually a lot of the EOs were struggling in literacy development way more than our second language learners were, and the teachers were shocked. So the universal screener kind of removes some of that assumption and bias, and it tells us some important information right off the bat. Who's at standard or skill, who's below, who's far below, and even who's beyond. From there, this kind of tells you, okay, students who are at standard, they should be able to continue on with just regular classroom instruction and be fine until we do this again 3 times a year. Students who are below, they need a diagnostic, they're gonna need supplemental support, in addition to universal support, and they're gonna need progress monitoring. Students who are far below are also gonna need a diagnostic, likely intensified support, in addition to supplemental support, in addition to universal support, and progress monitoring. And then I included the students who are beyond standard because we don't want to just focus on our students who are struggling. We want to focus on our students who are excelling. How do we keep them on that accelerated path? Those students are going to need supplemental support, almost like intervention, to keep them on that trajectory and that momentum forward, in addition to universal support and monitoring the progress that they're making as well. So I actually sat down, we did this as a district. We broke off into grade level teams, and we had grade level teams identify the main areas that their students were continuously struggling in. What screener data was gonna tell them that, and then what specifically were they gonna do, diagnostics, and instructional intervention strategies to meet those students' needs. So this started happening across the district. So those first grade teams sat down and they decided, okay, here's the diagnostic we're all gonna agree upon. Here's the intervention lessons from our curriculum that we all have access to that we're gonna use to address this particular skill or standard. Here's how we're all gonna monitor that progress. And they did that across 23 school sites, K-6. And they're still using that system to make sure that they're creating equitable systems of intervention and identification for students into special education. Okay, I think I got there. So, the last thing to think about is what might be the barrier preventing all of this from working? Because like we've been talking about all day, these are systems. One teacher can do it really well in their classroom, and that's awesome for those kids who are lucky enough to get that teacher. But how do we make sure that it's happening across that grade level, across that school, across that district, county, state, whatever? Teaming and coaching. How are we building people's capacity through relationship to be able to do all of these things that we're asking people to do? Between the teacher and the principal, from teacher to teacher, teacher to coach, teacher to student, teacher to parent. What resources do we have to help us get there? There's a resource inventory on page 24, where you're able to identify curriculum, space, people, time, stuff like that, that will help you drive your system. There's information on how to take a better look at your master schedule so that you know your master schedule's not the thing that's creating the barriers. And then finally, a practice profile. That's where you're able to describe the gold standard. What would this look like if we did this perfectly? And where are we at now? How are we gonna get there? And then how are we going to train new folks on this practice so that we're not continuously having to go back and reinvent this wheel? So again, way more information in there than I could ever share with you in 1 hour. I forgot to mention the data snapshots go along with those 3 types of data. It allows you to identify what data are we looking at when we're talking about student outcomes in academics, behavior, and social emotional. But then what implementation data are we looking at? How do we know that we're implementing our SEL program the way we say we are? How do we know that we're implementing our PBIS as it was designed? How do we know that we're using our curriculum in the way that it was designed? Implementation data. And then there's also a way to capture what capacity data do we have? How do we know that we've built the capacity of the system to do this? It might be professional development, it might be staff meetings, it might be practice profiles, policies, whatever it is that shows we've done the work necessary to build the capacity of this system. Oftentimes, not only does it show what you've done, it shows what hasn't been done, right? And that's where the work can center around. It's not like a shameful thing. It's a way to identify the holes in the practices so that we can build the systems that we want. Okay, it's officially 4:20. I think online people get cut off. You didn't bring me any questions, so I think maybe that means no questions from the audience. I can take live questions. Yes. So what do you mean you're coming with 7 teachers? Can you tell me a little bit? Right, okay. Yeah. So I'm actually coaching a middle school right now that's going through something similar, and they were using their PLC process to look at student academic data and identify what was the thing that students were missing. So they come together both as grade level teams and as department teams, and they take a look at that student data. And what they're finding is that most of their students, the barrier to acquiring content is usually a literacy barrier. So they're having conversations as a school around how can we help our students develop those literacy skills so that we can see more academic achievement in content areas. And what they did was they met around something similar. They didn't go through the exact tiered intervention matrix because, like I said, it's kind of a lot for teachers. But they met with their principal and their coach, and they came up with specific strategies that they were all going to incorporate into their universal instruction to impact those literacy skills. And they were doing that for, I think 4-week cycles is what it was. So they'd do that, they'd all go try it, and 4 weeks later, they'd come back and talk about what did we do, how did it go, what do we need. So once that system was in place, they would let that go for 4 weeks. Week 2, they would then do the exact same thing for student social emotional learning. What trends are we seeing across the board with our students' SEL? And so again, they came up with strategies that they were specifically gonna go try. They were all gonna try to do it. They did that. So week 1, was academics, week 2 was SEL, week 3 was keep the wheels going, week 4 was keep the wheels going, and then week 5 was back to academics, right? So then they thought, what if week 3 became behavior, where we start talking about trends and patterns that we see in our students' behavior, what practices are we gonna try to incorporate them? So they did that, week 1 academics, 2 SEL, 3 behavior, 4 keep the whole plane flying, 5 go back and revisit that academic data, right? Then they decided, what if that 4th week instead of just keep the plane flying, we took a look at who's in all of those. What students are we looking at academically, behaviorally, and social emotionally? And how can we then do something more for those students? So then week 4 became what they called the frequent flyers. So week 1, academics, week 2, SEL, week 3, behavior, week 4, frequent flyers, week 5, circle back to academics, week 6, SEL, behavior, frequent flyers. And so those are their data team PLC meeting cycles. They meet once a week, every Monday afternoon, and they look at the data that's according to that schedule. You had a hand in the back? So they have early release. So this particular school gets out at 12:55 on Mondays. Excuse me, from 1 to 2 are their PLC meetings. And then from 2 to 3, that time alternates. Some weeks it's the other PLC, where, remember how I said they meet as grade levels and as departments? So sometimes it's the other PLC, sometimes it's staff meeting. So they use their Monday early release time to be able to have those two particular meetings. Sometimes it's like they get to plan, work in your classroom, that sort of thing. So that was a time resource, right? When they took a look, what resource do we have? Well, we have this time on Mondays. How can we use that most effectively? Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all for sticking around literally till 4:25. I appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you.